Part 1. Medieval Plague Doctors, the dark truth behind their practices. Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the candles, close the shutters, and take a quiet walk through the most comforting topic imaginable, the Black Death. Yeah, I know. Relaxing, right? Don't worry, we're not here to relive the screaming, the coughing, or the rats doing interpretive dance in medieval streets. We're here for something gentler. The story of the plague doctors, the mysterious, bird-faced figures of medieval medicine, who looked like they walked straight out of a steampunk fever dream, and, honestly, kind of did. So, fluff your pillow, take a deep breath, and settle in. Because tonight, we're peeling back the layers of myth and mildew to uncover the darkly fascinating truth behind those iconic bird masks, the weird herbs stuffed inside them, and the very questionable medical science that led people to believe a man in leather pajamas could save them from the apocalypse. Let's begin. Picture this. It's the year 1348. Europe smells bad. People are dying faster than anyone can bury them. Priests are out of prayers, and physicians are out of ideas. And then, through the mist and miasma, a figure appears. Long black robe, wide-brimmed hat, and that bizarre bird mask with glass eyes staring out like a nightmarish owl. This was the plague doctor, half healer, half omen. Because when one of these guys walked into your town, it usually meant things were about to get worse. Now, contrary to popular belief, plague doctors weren't medieval superheroes. They weren't even particularly good doctors. Most, in fact, were barely doctors at all. The job was so dangerous that actual trained physicians tended to politely decline. So towns hired whoever was desperate enough to sign the contract. Sometimes failed med students, sometimes local barbers, sometimes just random men who owned a robe and were okay with dying young. Let's pause here and talk about that outfit. Because that costume, the bird mask, the waxed robe, the cane, has become one of the most recognizable symbols of the Middle Ages. But it wasn't exactly fashion-forward medieval couture. It was, instead, an early attempt at personal protective equipment, though early attempt might be doing a lot of heavy lifting there. The plague doctor outfit as we picture it today wasn't actually standardized until the 1600s, during later outbreaks. Designed by a French physician named Charles Delorme, a man who, clearly, had never heard of subtlety. Delorme believed that if disease came from bad air, or miasma, then you just needed to make sure no bad air touched your skin. Simple, right? So he created a full-body leather suit, sealed tight with wax, topped with gloves, boots, and a mask shaped like a bird's beak. The beak wasn't for aesthetic reasons, though it did give them a certain evil crow priest vibe. It was actually meant to hold a variety of herbs and perfumes, things like lavender, mint, cloves, and, for some reason, vinegar-soaked sponges. Basically, the plague doctor was walking around smelling like a medieval potpourri sachet, convinced it would keep the bad air out. Of course, it didn't work, but the placebo effect can be powerful, especially when the alternative is hopelessness. And the cane, ah yes, the mysterious cane. In movies, it's usually portrayed as a symbol of authority, or maybe something to lean on dramatically while staring at the horizon. In reality, it was, well, for poking people. Gently. From a distance. Doctors used it to lift the bedsheets of patients, point to things, or check if someone was alive without actually touching them. A sort of 6-foot social distancing stick, centuries before the concept existed. They also used it to keep crowds away, because nothing says respect the quarantine like a man in a bird mask waving a stick at you. Now, let's drift into the less glamorous part of the story, their medical treatments. Plague doctors had no idea what the plague actually was. They didn't know it was spread by fleas carried on rats. Germ theory wouldn't exist for another 500 years, so their treatments were a blend of medieval guesswork and good old-fashioned nonsense. One common method, bloodletting, because if you're sick, clearly you just have too much blood. The doctor would open a vein, drain a few ounces, and wait for the patient to feel worse, which somehow they took as a good sign. Then there were the poultices, smearing the buboes, those painful swellings, with various curatives. Some doctors used a mixture of butter, onion, and garlic. Others went for crushed emeralds, which, to be fair, at least looked fancy. And then there were those who recommended pigeon carcasses laid directly on the sores. Don't ask why pigeons. Medieval medicine didn't do why. Now, we might laugh at their methods, but it's worth remembering that these people were doing the best they could in a time when scientific method was still just guess and hope. And there's something almost touching about the fact that despite the danger, plague doctors did try to help. They showed up. They treated the sick, even if what they were doing was medically questionable at best. Of course, many of them didn't survive. Being a plague doctor was less a career, more of a countdown. But for towns struck by fear and death, the presence of that eerie bird-masked figure offered a strange kind of comfort. Like, sure, everything's collapsing, but at least someone's here in a leather beak to watch it happen. Now, you might wonder, how did they even get paid for this? And the answer is, very carefully. Most plague doctors were hired on contract by city councils. The terms were usually something like, treat everyone, keep records of deaths, and try not to die yourself, which should tell you everything you need to know about the job's risks. They also had to write reports, detailed lists of who died, what symptoms they had, and how long they lasted. These records, while grim, actually became invaluable centuries later for historians studying the spread of the plague. So, even though they didn't save many lives, they did leave behind one of the earliest forms of epidemiological data. You could say they were the world's first public health bureaucrats, in masks. But there's another layer here, the symbolism. Over time, the plague doctor stopped being seen as a healer and became something closer to a harbinger of doom. Art from the late Middle Ages and Renaissance often depicted them as grim reaper-like figures, haunting the edges of dying cities. In festivals and carnivals, the costume turned into a parody, an icon of death itself, stripped of its original, if misguided, purpose. And yet, the image persists. That beaked mask still fascinates us. It's part mystery, part morbidity, part nostalgia for a time when we didn't understand the world, but we still tried to protect ourselves from it, even if we did so by stuffing herbs into a bird's nose and hoping for the best. Let's float over now to the deeper side of the plague doctor myth, how the legend spread far beyond Europe, taking on its own life. Because, as with most medieval things, the truth got blurry somewhere between fact, fear, and folklore. Some believed the plague doctor wasn't human at all, but an omen, a supernatural visitor who appeared before outbreaks, marking towns for death. People swore they saw the Birdman wandering silent through the streets at night, watching from a distance, his glass eyes reflecting torchlight. Of course, that might just be sleep-deprived citizens hallucinating, but it stuck. And centuries later, the bird doctor became a permanent fixture in horror, art, and even modern fashion. And while we now know the real plague doctors were far less mysterious, more overworked civil servants than death spirits, the myth lives on because the image feels true. It captures the essence of that time, fear, helplessness, and humanity's desperate attempt to look like we had control. So, as we drift further into this historical fog, picture again that lonely figure walking through the empty streets of a dying medieval town, the air thick with smoke and incense, the sound of church bells tolling, and the slow, rhythmic steps of a man who thought he could keep death at bay with lavender and leather. Of course, he couldn't, but that's what makes the story.
Part 2. The Business of Death. Plague superstitions, false cures, and medieval medical chaos. Hey again! If you're still awake, or half dreaming, congratulations. You've officially survived the first act of the world's most depressing bedtime story. But don't worry, it doesn't get scarier, just weirder. Tonight, we float deeper into the fog, into a world where superstition became science, perfume was medicine, and rats were just innocent bystanders in humanity's ongoing misunderstanding of hygiene. So let's pick up right where we left off. Europe, mid-14th century. The plague has settled in like an unwanted house guest who refuses to leave, and everyone's scrambling for answers. And when people don't have science, they get creative. Let's start with one of the medieval crowd favorites, the bad air theory, or miasma. The idea was simple. Disease came from poisonous air. Basically, if it smelled bad, it was bad. And considering most cities in the 1300s smelled like open sewers mixed with despair, people were understandably nervous. That's why plague doctors filled their beaks with herbs, not just for their own protection, but also to purify the air around patients. Whole towns burned incense, threw flowers into the streets, and walked around holding posies under their noses. You know the old nursery rhyme, ring-a-ring-a roses, a pocket full of posies? Yeah, that's not about kids' games. It's about the plague. Nothing like a little mass death to inspire future lullabies. Of course, if bad smells cause disease, then it only followed that good smells cure it. Which brings us to one of the most unintentionally hilarious trends of the era, the perfume panic. Wealthy nobles began hoarding sweet-smelling items like it was medieval aromatherapy. Ambergris, musk, and sandalwood were suddenly worth more than gold. People carried pomanders, small metal balls filled with herbs, around their necks, waving them like magical air fresheners. And if that sounds silly, remember, these people also thought bathing was dangerous because it opened the pores and let the plague in, so they skipped water and went straight for cologne. Picture a medieval court full of sweaty, unwashed nobles trying to outstink each other with roses and vinegar. It was less royal elegance and more human salad bar. Now, perfume wasn't the only cure. The marketplace of medieval medicine was booming and absolutely terrifying. If you were sick, you could go to an apothecary, a healer, a priest, a barber surgeon, or just that one guy in the market who swore he had a magical toad amulet. Everyone had a theory, and none of them were good. Some doctors swore by bloodletting. Again, others recommended leeches, because when has adding a worm to your body not helped? There were also purgatives, basically medieval laxatives, in case the disease was hiding in your stomach. Spoiler, it wasn't. And then there were the more creative options. One remedy suggested pressing a chopped-up snake against the buboes. Another advised rubbing a chicken's backside on the wounds. Yes, really. Some patients were told to drink vinegar mixed with mercury, because nothing says healing like mild chemical poisoning. It's almost impressive how confidently wrong they were. Religion, of course, also got involved, because when logic fails, faith fills the gap. Many people believed the plague was God's punishment for sin, which meant the cure wasn't herbs or medicine, but repentance. Cue the flagellants, traveling bands of zealots who wandered from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public squares to atone for humanity's sins. Imagine walking out of your house and seeing 50 shirtless men chanting and hitting themselves with chains. The 1300s were basically one long fever dream. At first, people admired them. They looked holy, devoted, and slightly unhinged, which was the medieval gold standard. But as their procession spread the plague even further, turns out whipping doesn't kill bacteria, the church started to frown on the whole spectacle. Eventually, the Pope banned flagellant groups, which, to be fair, was one of the church's better decisions. Let's not forget the blame game, though, humanity's favorite pastime. When no one understands a disaster, someone's always accused of causing it. In the plague years, that someone was often Jewish communities, foreigners, or basically anyone who looked different. Rumors spread that Jews were poisoning wells or using black magic. These lies led to horrific massacres and expulsions across Europe, a dark, violent reaction born out of fear and ignorance. So while plague doctors were out there waving their canes and sniffing herbs, terrified mobs were burning innocent people. And that's the cruel irony of it all. The disease didn't need help spreading. Humans did that just fine. But if you zoom out a little bit, you can see the strange economic side effect of all this, a literal business of death. As the plague swept through Europe, traditional hierarchies began to wobble. There weren't enough workers, priests, or grave diggers. Prices for labor shot up. Wages doubled, sometimes tripled. And for the first time in centuries, peasants realized they actually had bargaining power. Imagine half the population is gone, and suddenly your humble job making candles pays like a CEO position. It was grim prosperity, an economy built on absence. Meanwhile, plague doctors, undertakers, and coffin makers became local celebrities. Their work was horrifying, but in demand. Some doctors charge extra fees for premium protection, read more herbs in the beak, and families paid anything for a house call. It was the ultimate hazard pay, except the hazard usually won. And yet, amidst all this death, people kept living, sort of. In towns hit hardest, new customs appeared. Doors were marked with red crosses to signal infection. Bodies were buried in mass pits, blessed by priests from a safe distance. Families sung hymns through closed windows. And when the dead outnumbered the living, cities began to adapt, creating new rules for quarantine. The word quarantine, by the way, comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. Ships arriving at Venetian ports had to wait offshore for 40 days before anyone could disembark. Why 40? No one knew. It just sounded biblical and neat. And it worked, at least better than chicken butts. Now, let's talk about the people behind the masks again. Those weary plague doctors who drifted from city to city, often strangers in foreign lands. For many, being a plague doctor wasn't about fame or science. It was survival, or sometimes punishment. Some were criminals offered pardons if they took the job. Others were failed physicians trying to redeem their careers. And a few, unbelievably, saw it as an opportunity. Because when everyone else ran from the plague, someone had to stay. Someone had to record the deaths, issue burial certificates, and make sure property got passed on. In a world where the line between medicine and paperwork was blurry, the plague doctor was both healer and bureaucrat, the grim middleman between life, death, and taxes. And yes, taxes. Cities still collected them. Even in the apocalypse, the taxman persisted. It's also worth noting how much the plague shaped medical record-keeping. Those dusty death lists the doctors compiled became the first primitive epidemiological data in Europe. Centuries later, historians and scientists would use them to map how the Black Death spread, proving, unintentionally, that the men in masks did leave a legacy, even if it wasn't the one they expected. Of course, the doctors themselves usually didn't live to see any of that. Most contracts ended abruptly, not because of termination, but because of, well, termination. And when they died, their belongings, including the plague outfit, were often burned or buried with them, which is partly why so few authentic plague masks survive today. The ones we see in museums are usually later reconstructions or ceremonial copies. The real ones? Dust, long ago. Still, the idea of the plague doctor survived. Over the centuries, the image turned into a cultural icon, equal parts terror and fascination. By the Renaissance, you'd find plague doctors showing up in plays, masquerades, and art, usually as comic characters, bumbling and pompous, because as humans tend to do, we turned our trauma into a joke. And perhaps that's why the image lingers today, because it's haunting, yes, but also oddly human. The plague doctor wasn't a villain. He was a man trapped in a nightmare, doing his best with the tools he had. He believed in bad air, herbs, and divine mercy. He wrote reports by candlelight. He buried friends. He kept walking. As the centuries rolled on and new plagues came, smallpox, typhus, cholera, the same old habits returned. The bird mask faded, but the mindset stayed. Fear the air, trust the ritual, avoid the sick. Even into the 18th century, you could still find doctors in padded coats and perfumed masks trying to hold back invisible forces. Then came the microscope, the discovery of bacteria, and suddenly the miasma theory collapsed overnight. The world realized disease wasn't about air or smell, but life too small to see. The bird beak went from science to superstition, from protection to theater. And now, centuries later, it's costume. You'll see it at festivals and video games. Part 3. After the Black Wind. How the plague reshaped faith, art, and the human mind. Hey again, sleepy traveler. If you've made it this far, you're officially one of the brave ones, or maybe just too tired to reach for the stop button. Either way, welcome back. Tonight, we're gliding past the masks and into what came after the Black Death, the strange new world it left behind. Because here's the thing about cataclysms. They don't just kill people, they change the way the survivors think. And the Black Death didn't just kill millions, it cracked open the Middle Ages like a rotten egg and poured out the beginnings of modern Europe. So, pull your blanket a little closer. The worst has already happened. Now, we just have to live with it. Let's start with faith, because that was the first thing to break. Before the plague, medieval Europe was a spiritual monolith. The church was everything. Judge, healer, government, and therapist all ruled into one. People didn't just believe in divine punishment, they built their lives around it. And then came the Black Death. Priests prayed, bishops held processions, the Pope ordered days of fasting, and yet people kept dying. By the thousands, then the millions. Priests dropped mid-mass. Monks died in their cloisters. Even the Pope's doctors couldn't save him from nosebleeds of divine irony. Faith cracked. Suddenly, people started asking uncomfortable questions, like, why would God wipe out entire villages? Or, why does he kill children and spare drunk merchants? It was the kind of quiet, dangerous doubt that reshaped a civilization. Some people turned more religious, doubling down, flagellating harder, and accusing anyone who didn't join them of heresy. Others walked away from the church altogether. The institution that had promised safety was helpless. And when an all-powerful system looks powerless, people start looking elsewhere for answers. You could almost say the seeds of the Renaissance were planted in plague pits. Art changed too. Before the plague, medieval art was stiff, formal, and focused on salvation. Everyone looked calm, holy, and vaguely uncomfortable, like they'd all been forced into a family photo they didn't want to take. After the plague, things got darker. Suddenly, death wasn't an abstract concept anymore. It was a daily visitor. So artists started painting skeletons. Lots of skeletons. Skeletons dancing, skeletons playing instruments, skeletons leading nobles and peasants alike to the grave. This new theme became known as the danse macabre, or dance of death. It was art as therapy. a way for people to laugh nervously at the thing that terrified them most. And it spread everywhere. Church murals, manuscripts, carvings, all filled with imagery of death, not as a monster, but as an equalizer. Kings and beggars alike danced the same final waltz. It was grim, yes, but also strangely comforting. Because if everyone dies the same way, maybe life isn't so unfair after all. And then there was the literature. If you can call plague writing literature when half the authors wrote between funerals. In Italy, Giovanni Boccaccio wrote the Decameron, a collection of stories told by 10 young people hiding from the plague outside Florence. They tell tales of love, greed, stupidity, and lust, because apparently, even at the end of the world, humans will still gossip. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer began writing the Canterbury Tales a few decades later, also full of pilgrims, stories, and a strong sense of life goes on. It's hard not to see these works as emotional rebounds, civilization processing grief through storytelling. Even the tone of writing changed. Before the plague, it was all about piety. After, it became personal, real, darkly funny. People had stared death in the face and realized that laughing at it was the only way to stay sane. But the biggest shift, the one that would quietly rebuild the world, happened in medicine. Because as devastating as the Black Death was, it forced people to start questioning medieval medicine. All those herbs, bloodlettings, and pigeon ointments hadn't worked. The doctors died just like everyone else. So, some curious minds started asking, why? And in those questions lay the faint beginnings of scientific thinking. In Italy, scholars like Guy de Chauliac, a surgeon who somehow survived the plague, began documenting symptoms, treatments, and outcomes with more precision than anyone before him. He didn't know what bacteria were, but he did know patterns. And that was enough to set medicine on a slow path to reason. Over time, medical schools across Europe began shifting focus from astrology and humors to anatomy and observation. The body wasn't just a vessel for the soul anymore. It was a machine that could be studied. And the Renaissance doctors who followed would dissect cadavers, illegally at first, and start mapping the human form in ways that horrified priests but thrilled scientists. And that quiet rebellion, that belief that disease had natural causes instead of divine ones, began with the failure of the plague doctors. Sometimes, progress begins with a bad diagnosis. And speaking of bad diagnoses, let's talk about survivor's guilt, medieval edition. After the worst years passed, those who lived were different. They'd lost neighbors, families, and entire towns. Some became fatalistic, believing they'd been spared for a reason. Others became reckless, drinking, gambling, and indulging in what one monk called unholy cheerfulness. And who could blame them? After years of horror, people were starved for joy. This wild pendulum swing between despair and hedonism defined late medieval Europe. Taverns filled up again, so did brothels, marriage rates spiked. People rebuilt their homes and their appetites. If the world could end tomorrow, might as well live today. The economy, too, was forever altered. As we mentioned earlier, the labor shortage gave peasants leverage for the first time in centuries. Serfs walked off manors demanding wages, and when lords refused, some just left, migrating to cities in search of better opportunities. It was in a way the birth of the working class. Laws were passed to stop wages from rising too high because, heaven forbid, peasants get comfortable, but it was too late. The social structure had shifted. The old feudal world where everyone was born into their place began to crumble. That slow crumble would eventually lead to revolts, revolutions, and a brand new Europe. You could draw a faint, wibbly line from the Black Death all the way to the Industrial Revolution. Not a straight line, more like a tragic scribble, but a line nonetheless. And while all this rebuilding was happening, cities began rethinking something they'd never seriously considered before: public health. Before the plague, sanitation meant throw your garbage somewhere else. After it, towns began organizing rudimentary waste systems, inspections, and quarantine procedures.
Venice led the way again, establishing the world's first official quarantine station, or lazaretto, in 1423. Ships, goods, and passengers were isolated before entering the city. Other port towns copied the idea, because nothing motivates reform than several million corpses. Hospitals also changed. They went from being religious hospices, places to die peacefully, to proto-medical institutions. The focus shifted from salvation to treatment. And even though treatments were still mostly nonsense, the intent mattered. It was humanity trying to be rational again. Of course, not everyone was optimistic. Many believed the plague would return, and it did, again and again for centuries. The second pandemic continued to flare up well into the 18th century, striking cities like London, Paris, and Vienna in waves. Each time, the masks came back out. The bells tolled. The doctors marched in with their canes. But slowly, each outbreak killed fewer people, as hygiene, knowledge, and luck improved. And in between those outbreaks, the world moved on. People rebuilt churches, painted ceilings, wrote symphonies, and invented new ways to be confused by love. Humanity, it turned out, was resilient and stubbornly forgetful. Now, let's drift for a moment into the quieter corners of the post-plague world, the things that didn't make it into history books. In small villages, people told stories of ghosts, of wandering plague doctors who never took their masks off, even after death. They said you could hear their leather boots creaking on cobblestone streets on foggy nights. In some places, the bird mask became a folk omen. If you dreamed of the black physician, someone you loved would soon fall ill. Of course, that's just folklore, but it shows how deeply the trauma seeped into the collective memory. The plague wasn't just an event, it was a haunting. Even centuries later, in art and writing, you can still feel its echo. That strange mixture of fear, fascination, and resignation. By the time the Enlightenment arrived, the world had changed beyond recognition. The church had lost its monopoly on truth, science was emerging from its chrysalis, and the humble plague doctor, once a symbol of hope, had become a relic, a reminder of how far we'd come and how far we'd once been lost. But the irony? When new pandemics struck, people still repeated the same patterns. They looked for scapegoats, they hoarded strange remedies, they distrusted authority, they panicked. Because some things, apparently, are pandemic-proof, especially human behavior. If there's one thread that ties the whole story together, from the
Part 4, The Long Shadow, From Plague Masks to Modern Medicine. Hey there, Night Owl. You've made it back. Welcome to the quiet end of our long, dark road, the centuries after the Black Death, when the masks were hung up, the bells stopped tolling, and the world tried, once again, to pretend it wasn't traumatized. In this final drift through history, we're going to trace how the plague doctor slowly transformed from a real human profession, sweating, terrified, and half-convinced lavender could save them, into something larger, a myth, a symbol, a ghost that still walks through our collective imagination. So take one last breath of candle smoke and rosewater. Let's walk through the ruins one more time. The Black Death had left scars everywhere, not just on the bodies buried under churchyards, but on the way people thought about life itself. Europe had been through something unspeakable, and even as it recovered, it never really forgot. By the 1400s and 1500s, the world was changing fast. Trade was booming, cities were growing, printing presses were spitting out ideas faster than anyone could censor them, and science was starting to nudge superstition off its throne. But plague was still here. It came back in waves, in 1499, 1528, 1575, 1603, 1629, 1665. Each time it arrived like a recurring nightmare. A few rats, a few fleas, and suddenly everyone was back in quarantine, holding posies under their noses and whispering prayers they'd already lost faith in.
And with every new outbreak came the familiar sight, the bird-masked doctors marching solemnly through the streets. Only now, they were more than just healers. They were icons. The costume that Charles Delorme had designed, the long waxed coat, gloves, glass-eyed mask, and stick, had become standardized. Every city had their own version, but the general look was the same, half bird, half specter. By the 1600s, the design wasn't just practical, it was theatrical. And it had to be. These men weren't just treating patients, they were performing stability. Think about it. When your entire city smells like decay and you're not sure if your neighbor will be alive tomorrow, seeing someone walk by in an official uniform, even if it looks like an evil duck, at least tells you that someone is still in charge. The costume was psychological armor, not just for the doctor, but for the people watching him. Still, not everyone was convinced by this new look. Writers of the time often mocked plague doctors as pompous frauds, wandering around with their sticks and smelling salts, pretending to measure disease. Satirists drew cartoons of them bumping into walls or accidentally poking patients in the wrong places. One Venetian playwright described them as half-priests, half-butchers, and holy fools, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely inaccurate. Many plague doctors were still amateurs, hired for hazard pay, not for skill. The suit gave them authority, but not knowledge. It's a bit like giving someone a hazmat suit and a stick and calling them a biologist. But there was something about that bird face, the way it was both ridiculous and terrifying, that captured the collective mood of the era. People laughed at it, but they also feared it. Because when that mask appeared in your street, you knew things were bad. Let's glide forward a little bit. To London, 1665, the last great plague outbreak in England. By now, London was a bustling, filthy city of 500,000 souls, theaters, taverns, and open sewers all competing for attention. And when the disease hit, it hit hard. Within months, entire neighborhoods were sealed off. Red crosses were painted on doors. The phrase, "Lord, have mercy upon us," became as common as hello. And yes, the plague doctors returned. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, wrote about seeing them in the streets. A dismal sight to see, the physicians in their gowns, walking like ghosts. He didn't say bird masks, but we can imagine the image. Gloved hands, black leather, glass eyes gleaming in the smoky London air. They recorded deaths, inspected the sick, and collected data for the bills of mortality, a grim census of the dying. And when the plague finally burned itself out, that was it. The last major visitation. After 1665, the bubonic plague would still appear in pockets around the world, but Europe's age of bird-masked medicine was over. What came next was quieter, the slow dawn of modern science. In the 17th and 18th centuries, a new generation of thinkers began to dismantle the old worldview piece by piece. Galileo had already pointed his telescope at the stars. Now others began peering into microscopes at things far smaller and far more dangerous. In 1676, a Dutch lensmaker named Antony Leeuwenhoek became the first person to see bacteria. He didn't know what they were, of course. He called them animalcules, tiny little beasties swimming in a drop of water. But that one discovery changed everything. Suddenly, bad air seemed a bit less convincing. It would take another 2 centuries for germ theory to fully develop, but the door had opened, and through it came the future. Medicine began to shed its mystical robes and put on a lab coat. Anatomy classes became more precise. Surgery became more professional. Hospitals became cleaner, eventually. And the idea that disease had natural, discoverable causes began to replace divine punishment. If the Middle Ages were about praying the sickness away, the Enlightenment was about experimenting it away. And as the science advanced, the old plague mask became obsolete. The beak doctor turned from a public servant into a historical curiosity, something to paint in allegory, to joke about in carnival plays, to parade during Venice's Carnival, where people wore plague masks for fun instead of fear. It was both satire and memory, laughing at the thing that used to terrify them. But the world never completely forgot what those masks had meant. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as cholera and typhus swept through industrial cities, echoes of the plague doctor returned, this time in the form of quarantine officers, sanitation inspectors, and later epidemiologists. They didn't wear beaks anymore, but the principle was the same. Protect yourself, record the data, isolate the sick. And with each new epidemic, from smallpox to Spanish flu, society remembered, consciously or not, the lessons learned from the plague years. Distance matters. Cleanliness matters. Documentation matters. Panic never helps. It's almost poetic how the medieval bird mask, ridiculous as it was, became the ancestor of every N95 and hazmat suit we know today. A little less leather, a lot more science. Now let's drift toward the artistic afterlife of the plague doctor, because if there's one thing humanity loves, it's turning tragedy into aesthetics. By the Romantic era of the 1800s, the plague doctor had become a symbol in paintings and literature. Artists depicted him not as a fool, but as a tragic figure, stoic, lonely, wandering through empty streets with only his herbs and hopelessness for company. Writers used him as a metaphor for isolation, knowledge, or death itself. In some plays, he became a grim narrator, the person who sees everything, saves no one, but remembers it all. And by the time modern pop culture got its hands on him, the transformation was complete. The plague doctor had gone from doctor to myth. In the 20th and 21st centuries, he shows up everywhere. Horror films, video games, metal bands, even plush toys. The mask's long beak and hollow eyes are instantly recognizable, a minimalist design for maximum unease. It's strange, isn't it, that something once meant to protect against death has become a symbol of it. But that's how history works. We recycle fear into art. And maybe that's why the plague doctor still fascinates us, because he sits perfectly on the edge between logic and superstition, science and myth. He represents the moment when we almost understood the world, but not quite. Of course, the real plague doctors, the men behind the masks, would probably be horrified to know that their work is now Halloween decor. They weren't trying to be mysterious, they were just coping. They didn't think of themselves as symbols. They were desperate, exhausted civil servants trying to survive a world that made no sense. They walked through streets of silence, scratching down names of the...
Part 5. The Ghosts That Still Wear Masks. A Gentle Epilogue. Hey again, Night Wanderer. You made it. All the way through the plague years, through leather masks and rosemary-stuffed pockets, through superstition, science, and survival. Now, we're in the quiet after the storm. This is the last stretch, the part of history that isn't really history anymore. It's the echo that lingers. The part where we look around centuries later and realize that the bird mask never really left us. It just changed shape. So let's end tonight not with fear or facts, but with reflection. Slow, soft, and maybe just a little ironic, because, of course, it always ends this way. When we think of the plague doctor today, we don't think of real people. We think of that silhouette, the black cloak, the long beak, the unreadable glass eyes. It's become shorthand for mystery, a visual metaphor for disease, secrecy, and the uncomfortable reminder that we don't control as much as we like to think. But behind that mask was something deeply human: confusion, compassion, and a desperate need to believe we were doing something useful, even if we weren't. And that might be the most relatable part of all. Because even in our shiny, modern, data-driven, Wi-Fi connected age, when we can map DNA and live stream surgeries, we still do the same thing. We still reach for masks. Not leather ones, maybe, but masks all the same. We put on confidence when we're scared. We wear logic when the world feels chaotic. We pretend we understand everything because the alternative, admitting we don't, feels too close to those plague years when ignorance could kill. So, in a strange, poetic way, the plague doctor isn't gone. He's just evolved. Let's wander forward a little, past the Enlightenment, past the Industrial Revolution, all the way to the modern pandemic age. When the world locked down again in 2020, something interesting happened. For the first time in centuries, everyone, everywhere, put on masks. Different materials, different science, but the same instinct. Protect yourself, protect others, hold on to whatever sense of control you can. And suddenly, those old 17th century bird masks started popping up online again, in memes, in art, in headlines. People joked about them, bought replicas, made darkly humorous TikToks. It was part coping mechanism, part curiosity. Because deep down, the sight of those masks felt familiar. We'd been here before. Of course, our modern masks had no lavender or vinegar-soaked sponges, no glass eyes, no eerie tapping stick. But the psychology was the same. That fragile human need to draw a line between safe and dangerous. To say, I am taking action, however small. Back in 1665, that action was stuffing herbs in a beak. In 2020, it was hand sanitizer and sourdough bread. Different centuries, same species. And it's not just pandemics. The plague doctor still appears in our art, our dreams, our Halloween aisles. He's been reimagined as a villain, a healer, an omen. Sometimes even a romantic figure, mysterious, tragic, wandering through Gothic cities under the moonlight. The internet, of course, made him a meme, because of course it did. There are Plague Doctor plushies, Funko Pops, neon wall signs, and thousands of fan drawings that make him look suspiciously attractive, because apparently nothing is too grim for the internet to flirt with. But the fact that people still draw him, still talk about him, says something profound. We are drawn to what we fear, especially when that fear feels historic, safe. It's easier to look at a 17th century mask than at our own reflection in the present. The irony is, plague doctors never wanted to be remembered. They weren't heroes or villains, they were placeholders, society's attempt to organize chaos. When things fell apart, the city would write a contract, hand a man a mask, and say, "You're the plague doctor now." He'd sign it, usually for good pay, and step into the role. He didn't wear the mask because he wanted to look scary. He wore it because he had to, because fear was contagious too, and professionalism was the antidote. In a way, the mask was less about medicine and more about ritual. It told people there is still order, someone is still keeping track, and maybe in the darkest moments, that was enough. It's easy looking back to laugh at them. The long coats, the vinegar sponges, the idea that smell could stop sickness. But when you think about it, we're not so different. They trusted smell. We trust statistics. They believed in miasma. We believe in data models. And both can fail us when the unknown knocks on the door. The more things change, the more human we stay. Sometimes, late at night, historians talk about how every age has its own version of the plague doctor. In the Middle Ages, it was the masked physician. In the 19th century, it was the scientist in his lab coat. In the 20th, the soldier medic. And in the 21st, maybe it's the healthcare worker in a blue plastic gown, face shield fogging up, standing under fluorescent lights. Different uniforms, same courage, same fear. When you look into their eyes, even behind a mask, you can almost see that same glimmer that once shone behind glass lenses in 1348 Florence or 1665 London. The quiet question, will this help? And maybe that's the real legacy of the plague doctor, not the beak or the myths or the memes, but that question, the humility of it. For all the arrogance people associate with medieval medicine, the plague doctor's story is, at its core, one of humility, of people realizing over and over that they don't understand the world nearly as much as they'd like to, and still showing up anyway. That's what makes their history so strangely comforting. Because in every era, in every crisis, someone puts on the mask and steps forward. Maybe trembling, maybe wrong, but still willing. Let's let that sink in for a moment. The candle is almost gone now, just a flicker at the edge of the table. Outside, the air is still. If you listen closely, you might almost hear the faint tap of a wooden cane on cobblestones. It's not real, of course, just memory. History doesn't haunt us with ghosts, it haunts us with echoes. And the plague doctor's echo is gentle. He's not here to scare you. He's just here to remind you that even in the darkest centuries, there were people who cared enough to try. And that, maybe, is the most hopeful thing history has to offer. So as the night settles, and your eyes grow heavy, remember, we live in the age of vaccines, microscopes, antibiotics, and data. But we also live in the age of memory, and sometimes memory keeps us humble. The next time you see a picture of that long-beaked mask, maybe you'll smile a little. Not because it's scary, but because it's human. Because once upon a time, someone put it on, terrified, and walked into the unknown. And somehow, you're here.